classic fighters of World War I were tough, deadly flying machines. Both sides spread terror with giant strategic bombers. Spy flights gathered intelligence about the enemy. Great artillery guns were directed from the air. Before the war, flying was a young science. It was hard enough to keep these fragile, dangerous flying machines in the air, let alone use them as weapons. This is the story of how military aviation in less than a decade grew from a vague theory to a comprehensive system of warfare. Before the war, the French army led the world in military aviation. It had about 250 aircraft. It staged exercises to simulate the conditions of war and explore the potential of the aeroplane. Planes made tentative steps towards combat. In Mexico in 1913, 2 American mercenaries had the first dogfight. An Italian pilot carried out reconnaissance and dropped bombs on enemy Turks in Libya. But when the First World War began, military aviation was little more than a set of theories. Germany declared war on Russia and France in August 1914. The major forces of both sides were traditional infantry, cavalry, and heavy artillery. But in 1914, for the first time in history, heavier-than-air flying machines were available for warfare. They were put to use right from the start. Eyes capable of flying behind enemy lines could see where artillery shells were falling and direct gunners onto their targets. They could also see enemy troop movements. In Belgium, in the 3rd week of the war, a French reconnaissance pilot saw streams of men in grey uniforms. They were German troops. His warning came just in time to allow the British force to retreat to safety. Two weeks later, in northern France, a Voisin biplane prepared for a routine flight. Up to that time, no aircraft had shot another down. Rifles and handguns had been ineffective. The observer, sitting in the front cockpit, was armed with a Hotchkiss machine gun. In the sky over Reims, the pilot saw a German 2-seater and chased it. The observer fired his machine gun, and the German dropped in flames. The world's first victim of aerial combat. In November, 3 Avros of the Royal Naval Air Service conducted a successful long-distance bombing raid. They hit the Zeppelin sheds at Lake Constance in Germany. They damaged 1 Zeppelin and destroyed a gasworks. By the end of 1914, aircraft had pioneered most of the standard missions of military aviation today. They were accepted as an essential part of 20th century warfare. As the war progressed, speeds would more than double. Aircraft range, size, and deadliness would increase enormously. The needs of war accelerated development far beyond the pace of the early years of flight. But that development would not have been possible without the foundations laid by aviation's pioneers. In December 1903, the Wright brothers made the world's first successful powered flight. They continued to develop their ideas at their own pace, unaffected by experiments in flight on the other side of the Atlantic. In Paris, Gabriel Voisin was among those who doubted stories of the Wrights' achievements. In 1905, Voisin was using the River Seine as a runway to help him launch a series of gliders. He was building and testing them for a syndicate dedicated to the development of French aviation. At a time when the Wrights were making controlled, powered flights, Voisin was using a high-powered motorboat to tow his gliders into the air. Voisin would go on to design many great aircraft of the First World War. But in 1905, he still had much to learn. In Paris, a prize of $10,000 was offered for a flight around a 1-kilometer course. One of the sponsors, Ernest Archdeacon, challenged the Wrights.
It will assuredly not tire you very much to make a brief visit to France simply to collect this little prize.
The Wrights did not visit Paris. They didn't have to. They were leading the world and intended to sell their invention to a national government that saw its potential. In the meantime, others in Paris were making attempts to fly. Among them was Brazilian-born Alberto Santos Dumont. Santos Dumont was famous for balloon flights and experiments with gliders. In November 1906, he took his flying machine to the Bagatelle, this playing field near the Bois de Boulogne. He'd already tried to fly with the help of an airship to lift his machine off the ground. It was not successful. On November the 12th, the French aviation fraternity was there in force to witness another attempt, without the airship. Santos Dumont had to stand up to fly the machine. He coaxed it into the air, and in 21 seconds covered a distance of more than 700 feet. It was the first time a European had taken off and flown convincingly. In Paris, Santos Dumont was hailed as the conquering hero. But Wilbur Wright did not share the general enthusiasm.
We do not believe there is 1 chance in 100 that anyone will have a machine of practical usefulness within 5 years.
But just 14 months later, Henri Farman, a dashing young racing driver, would prove Wilbur wrong. In January 1908, Farman, in this machine built by the Voisin brothers, attempted a flight around a 1-kilometer course to win the $10,000 prize. He succeeded. The prize was his, and so was the adulation of France. It was too much for the Wrights to ignore. They had already made a flight almost 40 times as long as Farman's. In the summer of 1908, Wilbur sailed for Paris to show the French what he could do. He set up operations at a racetrack near Le Mans, southwest of Paris. On Saturday, August the 8th, a crowd gathered to witness Wilbur's first flight in Europe. It lasted 1 minute and 45 seconds, slightly longer than Farman's prize-winning kilometer. But it was Wilbur's control that impressed French flyers. Louis Blériot said,
I would have waited 10 times as long to see what I have seen today. Monsieur Wright has us all in his hands.
The Wright's influence on French aircraft design, especially their control system, was profound. But tragedy struck the Wrights. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was killed at Fort Myer, Virginia in September 1908. He was a passenger in the plane Orville was demonstrating to the U.S. Army. It was the first death in the history of military aviation. French aircraft design progressed. By 1909, the idea of a flight across the English Channel was feasible. The British Daily Mail offered a prize of £1,000 for the first successful cross-channel flight. Wilbur Wright was not interested, but others were. On July the 19th, French pilot Hubert Laton made an attempt in his Antoinette monoplane. He flew from the little village of Sangat, south of Calais. Over the channel, his engine failed. The Antoinette dropped 1,000 feet into the sea. Laton sat on the floating wreckage, lit a cigarette, and waited to be rescued. Laton was not daunted.
I wasn't lucky this time, but the channel will be conquered.
He resolved to try again. Louis Blériot had made a fortune selling car accessories and spent it on aeroplanes. He intended to beat Laton across the channel, but had burned his leg badly on his plane's exhaust. 6 days after Laton's attempt, conditions on the French coast were calm. The competition rules said the flight must begin after sunrise. Sunrise was due at 4:41 a.m. This monument marks Blériot's takeoff point, just south of Calais. As he waited, Blériot's mind raced.
What was going to happen? Would I make it to Dover? Now I thought only of my machine, the engine, the propeller. Everything was going now, everything vibrating. At the signal, the crew let go. I was up.
At first, the flight was very smooth. The Anzani engine of Blériot's plane ran perfectly, and he forgot about the pain from his injured leg. But as Blériot made out the English coastline, the wind strengthened, and mist obscured his view. A stroke of luck allowed him to locate the opening in the cliffs he'd chosen as his landing spot. The landing was rough, but it didn't matter. He'd made it across the channel. Blériot scored an immense triumph. The 21-mile flight from France to England took only 37 minutes. But his achievement had symbolic meaning beyond time, speed, and distance. The world was confronted with the concept that aircraft could cross national boundaries. An island like Britain no longer had a protective moat that could be defended by a mighty navy. The aircraft in which Blériot made his channel crossing was his Model 11. It was to become one of the most popular and effective designs in aviation. This Blériot, from the old Rhinebeck Museum in New York, has an Anzani engine similar to the one that powered Blériot's historic flight. The soundness of the Blériot's design and construction would keep it breaking records and flying as a military aircraft beyond 1915. Seeing one in flight today gives a graphic idea of the flimsiness of aircraft construction at the time and the concentration and skill it took to stay in the air. Blériot's Channel crossing was the first aviation feat to overshadow the achievements of the Wright brothers, at least in the public eye. In the meantime, the Wrights were getting new customers. Early in 1909, the Italian military bought a Wright airplane and hired Wilbur to teach 2 Italian officers to fly it. This film was shot on that visit. It shows Italian political and military personnel watching one of Wilbur Wright's flights with a passenger on board. On the same visit, this film was shot. It's believed to be the first motion picture ever taken from an aircraft. Later the same year, back at Fort Myer in Virginia, Orville Wright completed the task he'd begun in 1908, satisfying the U.S. Army Signal Corps' requirements for a military aircraft. This time the military flyer passed all its tests of speed and endurance. This actual aircraft still exists. It's on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The Wrights now led the military aviation race, but there were other contenders. Designer-builder Glenn Curtiss was becoming competitive. The Wrights didn't like it. They tried lawsuits to stop Curtiss building and selling his designs. This is Reims, the old cathedral city northeast of Paris. In the summer of 1909, an event held there excited both the public and the military about aviation's potential. On Béthany Plain, where the Reims military airbase is today, these fields were cleared. An aeropolis with grandstands, hangars, and an air racing course was built. The event was called the Grand Week of Aviation, and hundreds of thousands of people came. Royalty, nobility, and the powerful of politics and military flocked to see the greatest names in aviation compete against each other. Reims Week demonstrated the speed, maneuverability, and endurance of the aeroplane as no one had seen it before. It convinced many military experts that aircraft were potential weapons. Blériot was there, and Laton, and Gabriel Voisin, and Henri Farman. From America, Glenn Curtiss was there. But the Wright brothers were not. There were some Wright aircraft flown by other pilots. The highlight for the thousands of spectators was a showdown between Louis Blériot and Glenn Curtiss for the Gordon Bennett Trophy. Blériot was the hot favorite, but Curtiss won by just 6 seconds at world record speed, 46 miles an hour. Reims Week showed that aircraft were practical, maneuverable, and by the standards of the time, fast. David Lloyd George, later to become Prime Minister of Britain, summarized its significance.
Flying machines are no longer toys and dreams. They are an established fact.
The Wright brothers continued a legal battle with Glenn Curtiss, trying to protect their control system patents. They became obsessed with litigation against Curtiss and others. Their progress slowed. They were overtaken by their competitors. This Curtiss D is similar to Glenn Curtiss's Reims aircraft. The ailerons used by Curtiss for lateral control are worked by the pilot's shoulders. Small surfaces between the wings oppose each other to make the aircraft bank. It was an attempt to avoid the Wright's patent on wing warping, in which banking was controlled by twisting the whole wing.
No, this cable's good shape here.
Like many other aircraft of the time, this one had an elevator in front of the pilot to control climbing and diving. It was a pusher, meaning that the propeller was at the rear. The person swinging the prop to start the engine had to climb inside a virtual wire cage and hope he didn't trip on the way out. Glenn Curtis and the Wrights suffered from the fact that flying was not fashionable among American military officers. Politicians were not lobbied for money to support it. American military aircraft didn't evolve as quickly as their European counterparts. Some Curtiss aircraft would achieve distinction in the Great War. They would include a trainer, the famous Jenny, and a successful line of flying boats. The name of Wright wouldn't figure at all. As military aviation bogged down in America, the story across the Atlantic was different. People flocked to aviation events. They subscribed large amounts of money to help its development. The public's enthusiasm was shared by the military. Aviation was seen as a new and dangerous sport, with strong appeal to the dashing and influential military officer class. Military influence persuaded governments to spend money on aviation. Established manufacturers prospered, and new ones appeared. This elegant monoplane is a French Henriot. Its layout is similar to the Blériot and the Antoinette. It has conventional tail surfaces and a single wing, all covered with stretched cloth. But its fuselage borrows from the art of the boat builder. It's wood, constructed in exactly the same way as a skiff used in rowing races. Building a strong fuselage was relatively simple. Attaching monoplane wings to the fuselage with equal strength was more of a problem. Wire bracing was a partial answer. The Henriot was a wing warper, patterned on the ideas of the Wright brothers, each wing twisted to make the plane bank. Wings that twisted could not also have structural rigidity. In Europe, the monoplane was fashionable before the Great War. But most of the significant aircraft produced between 1914 and 1918 would be biplanes. Monoplanes suffered structural failures. It was difficult to make them really strong. Engineers found it easier to design biplanes that could withstand the forces of battle. Flying these aircraft was dangerous. Pilots were inexperienced and control was difficult. Even before aircraft became involved in warfare, They took many lives. Few generals in the armies of Europe had any idea of the way this fragile new toy could be used in conjunction with troops and artillery on the ground. That was all still to come. This is the old Blériot Aéronautique factory in Paris. By 1910, Louis Blériot, aviation pioneer, was fast becoming a prosperous aircraft manufacturer. The Blériot 11 continued to be a success. It established speed records. It flew to high altitudes and over great mountains. There were close calls. It was all a grand adventure. Pilots were seen as heroes. They were people of great daring, courage, and a growing level of skill. This is Adolphe Pégoud, a Blériot test pilot known to the press as the foolhardy one. In 1913, Pégoud set out to become the first pilot to parachute out of his plane. He intended to reach his planned height, deploy the parachute, and allow it to drag him out of the cockpit. It worked on the first attempt, but
I received a good whack of the stabilizer on the shoulder.
Pégoud expected his Blériot to crash straight into the ground once he left the cockpit, but it didn't. He watched it descend.
My old crate did tricks on its own.
It occurred to Pégoud that he could learn to control the plane's involuntary maneuvers. He trained himself by hanging upside down. He strengthened his Blériot to withstand extra forces. He practiced in private before his first public show. He was not the first to perform a loop, but Pégoud was the first to make a well-planned attempt to explore the extremes of aircraft maneuverability.
To play with the elements of the air in any position and for any length of time, to handle all the treacheries of the atmosphere, and to put myself back on the ground gracefully with calm and confidence, that is my supreme joy.
It was also the joy of the great crowds that came to watch him, and of the many pilots who strove to imitate him and improve on his techniques. He generated a new confidence among his peers. Without knowing it at the time, he laid the foundation for maneuvers that would be soon used in battle by the first combat pilots, in a war that would transform aviation into a potent weapon. In 1913, Roland Garros, an eminent French pilot, made a non-stop 500-mile flight across the Mediterranean. To neighboring powers like Germany, the offensive potential of aviation became obvious. Anthony Fokker, the brilliant young Dutch designer, had moved to Germany. He and other German aircraft builders like Albatros and LVG borrowed freely from French designs. Germany also bought manufacturing rights for the Austrian Tauber monoplane. French experiments in arming aircraft included this unlikely machine gun placement in a Deperdussin monoplane. The gunner stood in the nose, so the bullets would clear the propeller arc. Darts, called fléchettes, designed to be dropped on the enemy, were said to pierce a soldier from head to toe. France held clear leadership in heavier-than-air technology. But Germany had the edge in balloons and rigid airships. Airships were extremely effective in promoting German national prestige. Record-setting international flights by Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin raised a crucial question of international law. Who owns the air? And what would provide the best military platform, the airship or the aeroplane? The airship, with its stability, seemed to have the edge. In the early summer of 1914, such questions were far from the mind of the ordinary European citizen. Crowned heads like King George V of England were aware of the tensions within Europe, but the prospect of war was remote. This is Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia. On June the 28th, the Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was there on a state visit. Shortly after this film of the Archduke was taken outside the Sarajevo City Hall, a Serbian terrorist assassinated him. The balance of European diplomacy was disturbed. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany favored Austrian reprisals against Serbia. The French president and the Russian Tsar were allies. Russia and France would support Serbia against Germany. As Europe enjoyed the summer weather, Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding that the assassination be investigated. At the same time, Austria mobilized its troops. Serbia agreed to most of Austria's terms, but also mobilized its troops. And then Austria declared war on Serbia. The whole of Europe was pulled into conflict. In Russia, 6 million men were called to arms. Germany prepared to declare war on Russia. There was tremendous public excitement at the prospect. France, Russia's ally, refused German requests to remain neutral. 3 million French soldiers were called into action. France also greeted the prospect of war with enthusiasm. There were old scores to settle with Germany. If Germany and France went to war, Britain could not allow German ships to sail into the English Channel. Britain would side against Germany. Germany was determined to attack Russia, but it knew it must deal with France first. Germany's Schlieffen plan to attack France depended on mobility by rail and road. It involved sweeping through Belgium and down the French coast, swinging east and overrunning Paris. On August the 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and the Schlieffen Plan went into operation. Germany believed that it would take 6 weeks for the large, ponderous Russian military machine to grind into action. By that time, German forces would be in Paris. Germany would avoid fighting a war on 2 fronts. The German army swept across neutral Belgium, subduing cities with massive new artillery and making harsh reprisals against resistance. The way into France was open. In aerial warfare theory, reconnaissance and bombing were the 2 major roles of the aeroplane. Both sides used them from the first days of the war. But theory was not practice. In the real conditions of battle, pilots and observers found it difficult to be sure what they were seeing on the ground. Sometimes they brought back information that was wrong. Aircraft like the Maurice Farman Longhorn were primitive, but they were useful for reconnaissance. The Maurice Farman Shorthorn was more sophisticated. It was flown by French and British squadrons early in the war. These aircraft are typical of the two-seaters used for reconnaissance at that time. Getting vital information to the ground quickly was difficult. One method used by both sides was sending messages by homing pigeon. Pigeons were especially useful at sea before radio communication was developed. Chief of Staff of the French armies in 1914 was General Joseph Joffre, an old soldier with experience in the Sahara Desert in the 1890s. One of Joffre's foremost generals was the dashing Ferdinand Foch. Joffre and his armies recalled with bitterness the lost French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, taken by the Germans in 1871. With the German army pushing into northern France, the French military saw an opportunity to counterattack using a long-standing French plan to recover Alsace-Lorraine. It was called Plan 17. On August the 4th, Plan 17 went into action. French troops crossed the German border, confident they could restore Alsace and Lorraine to France and drive on to the River Rhine. As the French force was advancing, one of the first failures of air reconnaissance in the war occurred. French aircraft were stationed near the border, but their patrols failed to detect the buildup of strong German artillery and machine guns. Shaken and bewildered by heavy losses, the French retreated. In mid-August, British airmen began to arrive in France. Royal Flying Corps Squadron aircraft started from Dover and entered France wherever the strong Channel winds took them. BE-2s, fresh from the Royal Aircraft Factory, were the first British aircraft in France. A BE-2 landed on French soil on August the 13th. Many more were to follow. Young British airmen found themselves living abroad for the first time. They were only a few miles from home soil in Britain, but culturally, they were in another world. Letters home from these young men were to become some of the most touching and illuminating documents of the war. Much of their sadness comes from the fact that many would be dead soon after setting pen to paper. In August, General Kitchener and 120,000 British troops arrived in France. This time, German air reconnaissance failed. The British arrival was a complete surprise to the Germans. Kitchener ordered his troops optimistically.
Soldiers must be constantly on their guard against temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both, and while treating all women with courtesy, you must avoid any intimacy.
German troops, too, were on foreign soil. German stomachs used to black bread rebelled against the unfamiliar French variety. As German troops approached Paris, the French government vacated the city and left General Gallieni in charge as military governor. Air reconnaissance told Gallieni the Germans were swinging away from Paris to the east, exposing their right flank. The aerial sightings were crucial. They would save Paris and halt the German advance. Gallieni and Joffre decided to attack the German forces in the nearby valley of the Marne River. The German troops were chasing exhausted British and French forces that had retreated 150 miles from Mons. But the Germans were tired, and many had been sampling the local wines on the way. In spite of the condition of the German troops, the battle did not start well for the Allies. In Paris, General Gallieni commandeered 2,000 taxicabs to drive newly arrived Tunisian troops to the Marne battlefield. In 4 days of savage fighting involving over 2 million men, casualties were enormous. For both sides, aircraft were a factor in the slaughter. They were immediately effective, directing artillery fire from the air and reporting on troop movements. By September the 7th, the Germans were beaten. The Schlieffen Plan had been destroyed. The German generals now had no hope of taking Paris and ending the war quickly. The German advance that had traveled so far, so fast, had become a retreat. Now the opposing armies raced back towards the English Channel, trying to outflank each other. As they went, they dug lines of trenches, from which each side would attempt to preserve its own territory. This deadlocked front of trenches and barbed wire would shape the evolution of military aviation for the rest of the war. As the autumn of 1914 moved toward winter, the war on the ground began to bog down in mud. Rain came, and the temperature dropped. In the trenches, there was no escape. But for those flying planes, it was different. If a plane could take off, it could move freely above the wall. This is an Avro 504, not a legendary aircraft, but one of the war's great workhorses. It was a British design, but like many Allied aircraft, used a French rotary engine. In a rotary, the whole engine revolves around a fixed shaft, and the propeller revolves with it. The airflow across the moving cylinders cools the engine. Castor oil lubricant is thrown back in liberal quantities in the face of the pilot. The Avro 504 entered service at the beginning of the war in August 1914. It had the misfortune to be the first British aeroplane to be brought down by enemy ground fire on August the 22nd in Belgium. But there were also early successes. A 504 carried out the war's first ground strafing run, using its Lewis machine gun against a train and German troops on October the 22nd. .504s of the Royal Naval Air Service conducted a series of successful bombing raids into German territory in October and November. The 504 was superseded in combat, But for the rest of the war, it had a distinguished career as the standard British trainer. This aircraft is the 504K, the last model in a long line of development. More than 8,000 504s were built during the war. It remains a great unsung hero. As the winter of 1914 approached, aviation activity was limited by the weather. For long periods, pilots and aircraft were grounded. Aerial combat was only a few months old. Yet in that time, pilots had experienced the birth of almost every major aspect of aerial warfare. Strategic bombing, reconnaissance, ground attack, aerial combat. They'd tried them all, with some degree of success. The winter was one of the worst for years. When regular flying became possible again, aerial warfare was poised to enter a new phase.
A young aviator lay dying at the start of a bright summer's day. To the mechanics assembled around him, these few parting words he did say. Take the cylinder out of my kidneys, the connecting rod out of my brain. From the small of my back take the crankshaft and assemble the engine again.